Welcome back, listeners.
Yep.
I've been really excited to dive into this topic, like truly excited for this one. It's radical acceptance. Have you heard of it?
Oh, yeah. I think it's a concept that resonates so deeply with, well, so many people, especially these days.
Exactly. It's like this invitation to, I don't know, maybe finally make peace with yourself, warts and all.
Totally. And it's not about resignation at all, right?
Right. Not at all. It's more like this really active path to a wise and tender heart, as Tara Brach puts it.
That's a beautiful way to put it. Wise and tender.
Yeah, her work is really what inspired this deep dive. And speaking of wise, Jack Kornfield said her work, well, he said it can just melt away all those barriers we build up. And then we can finally experience, real happiness and freedom, that deep kind within us.
I love that. It's like finally coming home to ourselves.
Exactly. And that's really what we're going to explore today, what radical acceptance really means, and importantly, how you can actually bring those principles into your own life.
Yes, especially when that feeling creeps in that something's wrong with me. We've all been there.
Oh, big time. That feeling's so universal, isn't it? It's like this constant companion for so many of us. So to make sure we're all on the same page, let's just lay out the main points we'll be covering.
Sounds good. A roadmap for our journey.
Okay, first up, that super common but often really painful experience, the inner critic, that voice telling you something's wrong with me. We're going to shine a light on that.
Then we'll look at where that feeling actually comes from, how it takes root, often in childhood, and through all those messages we get from, well, everywhere.
Then, of course, we have to get to the heart of radical acceptance, right?
Absolutely. And those two key ingredients are mindfulness and compassion. We'll see how they work together to create a strong foundation for self-acceptance.
And we won't just leave you hanging with the theory. We'll give you some concrete tools to, actually cultivate this in your own life.
Because let's be honest, it's not always easy, right?
Totally. So we'll also tackle those tricky bits, like why we sometimes make other people the villains in our stories, and the surprising power of just hitting the pause button, even for a second.
We'll also look at how to handle all those fears and desires that constantly swirl around, and we'll really emphasize the importance of self-compassion and loving kindness through it all.
And to round things off, we'll talk about how our relationships can be this amazing vehicle for this kind of acceptance, and how ultimately it leads us to this deeper understanding of who we really are, beyond all the labels and limitations we put on ourselves.
So it's a full journey we're taking together today.
It is. And I, for one, am ready. So let's dive in. That feeling we talked about, something's wrong with me. Tara Brach, she kicks things off with a story from her college days. She's with a friend, and this friend is like really consciously trying to be her own best friend. And Tara's hit by this like wave of realization. She's anything but her own best friend.
Mm-hmm.
What struck you about that opening?
It's that suddenness of her recognizing that, right? Like how many of us are walking around with this inner critic, this merciless voice, always judging, and we don't even realize how deeply it's impacting us.
Like background noise.
Yeah.
Always there.
Yeah.
But we've kind of tuned it out.
Exactly. And yet it's shaping how we feel about everything, about ourselves, about the world. It makes you wonder how many people are going through life with that same internal battle raging inside.
So many, I'd imagine. And for Tara, that realization led her to this, I don't know, this almost like core belief that something is fundamentally wrong with me, this deep down feeling of being flawed. And she says it doesn't just sit there passively. It drives so much of our behavior as we try to fix this perceived brokenness. How do you see that playing out like in everyday life?
Oh, everywhere you look. I mean, think about it. That constant striving for achievement, the next promotion, the perfect body, that perfectly curated, social media presence, it can all stem from this need to prove our worth, right? To compensate for that feeling of not being enough.
Like we're trying to outrun that feeling of inadequacy by achieving, acquiring, always doing more.
Exactly. Think of the person who's always chasing the next accomplishment but never feels satisfied. Or the activist who pours their heart and soul into fighting injustice, maybe partly driven by a feeling of, their own lack.
And then there's the flip side, right? The avoidance strategies.
Oh, absolutely. Addictions, constantly needing external validation. Anything to numb ourselves to the pain of that perceived fundamental flaw.
It's exhausting, really, just thinking about it. And the sad thing is, as Tara points out, even when we're outwardly successful, like what she calls highly functional, internally, we can still be struggling with anxiety, this drivenness, and often, deep down depression. It's like we can achieve all these things, but inner peace still feels, out of reach.
And what's really insightful is how this can creep into our spiritual lives, too. Chögyam Trungpa, the Buddhist teacher, he said, the problem is that ego can convert anything to its own use, even spirituality.
Wow, that's powerful.
Isn't it? So we might start a spiritual practice, looking for enlightenment, for inner peace. But if that core feeling of not enough is still there, we might just end up using spirituality to try to fix ourselves. Like we're still coming from that same place of insecurity.
So the activity changes, from climbing the corporate ladder to meditating for hours. But the underlying motivation is the same: to be better, to be different, to be fixed, even within a spiritual context.
Right. And Tara makes this point that it makes sense, that those self-doubts would find their way into our spiritual journey, especially for people battling that feeling of not being good enough, the idealistic worldviews, promising purity and transcendence. They can be so appealing.
So the quest for spiritual perfection can become just another way for the ego to try to control things.
Right.
To control and perfect the self.
Exactly. It's this reinforcement of that initial belief. That there's something inherently wrong that needs fixing. It's a never-ending cycle.
This is kind of blowing my mind a bit. Because intellectually, we can grasp the idea of inherent worthiness, right? That we don't need to earn our worth. But emotionally, so many of us still feel like outsiders.
Yeah.
Like we haven't quite qualified for belonging. Why do you think that gap exists between what we understand intellectually and what we feel emotionally?
Well, because this belief, this something's wrong with me feeling, it's often operating at a much deeper level. It's not just a thought. It's an emotional truth we've internalized through years of experience.
Like it's been programmed into us.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So even if our conscious mind gets it, gets the idea of inherent worthiness, that emotional pattern is still running the show. It's like trying to break a really deeply ingrained habit. It takes more than just knowing it's not good for you.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. In Chapter 1, The Trance of Unworthiness, we start to see how this feeling develops. And Tara, she highlights the impact of, our imperfect parents.
Right. Because let's face it, perfect parents don't exist.
Definitely not. We all have those moments where our parents, bless their hearts, maybe they weren't exactly attuned to our needs.
For sure. They're human, after all. Shaped by their own experiences, their own imperfect parents, and the culture they grew up in.
It's like this generational relay race. But we're passing down anxieties instead of batons.
Exactly. Those fears, insecurities, and desires, they get transmitted, sometimes in really subtle ways. Maybe parents unconsciously project their own anxieties onto their kids, or they have these sky-high expectations based on their own unfulfilled dreams.
Or maybe they just model, some not-so-healthy coping mechanisms.
Right. And it's important to remember they're seeing their children through their own lenses. Maybe a fear that their child won't be happy or successful, or a desire for them to achieve what they couldn't. It's a complicated web, really.
Definitely. And then there's the whole cultural piece too, right?
Huge. Parents, they're the first messengers of our culture. And they convey, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, that certain emotions are just not okay. Like anger, sadness, fear. They're bad.
So the child who cries is told to toughen up. The child who shows anger is labeled difficult.
And in more extreme situations, it can be even more damaging. Messages like, you're bad, you're in the way, even, you're worthless.
Wow, that's heavy stuff. But even in less extreme cases, those subtle messages can have a lasting impact.
Right. Absolutely. Most of us learn, one way or another, that maybe our desires, our fears, our unique way of seeing the world, they don't always matter that much. And maybe we need to be different, better, to be accepted within our families and society, everywhere.
Yeah, it's like we're constantly being nudged towards conformity.
Right. And Tara shares this story about Jeff. At a retreat, he remembers going to his mom as a kid, feeling hurt after playing with his brother. He wanted her to intervene to comfort him, and her reaction was dismissive. Basically, don't be so needy. He learned right then to suppress his vulnerability, to believe that his pain wasn't okay, that needing comfort was a sign of weakness.
Oof, that must have been tough. And you can imagine how one interaction like that could shape how he deals with emotions and needs, his whole life.
For sure. It plants the seed that our needs and emotions are a burden, something to be ashamed of, something to hide.
Which leads us to another common coping mechanism, doesn't it? Staying busy.
Ah, yes. Busyness. The socially acceptable addiction.
Seriously. Why do we do that? Why is being busy so often our default?
Yeah, it's a brilliant way to avoid facing our pain, isn't it? In our culture, busyness means you're productive, you're worthy. We praise people who are always on the go. Stillness, That's almost scary.
Because then we might actually have to face those uncomfortable feelings, right?
It's
Being alone and maybe not being enough.
exactly. So we fill our lives with stuff, with activities, with noise. We buy things. We engage in endless chatter, always checking our phones, scrolling, watching, listening, anything to keep our minds occupied, to bury those feelings of vulnerability.
It's almost like a constant state of distraction. Like we can't handle being alone with ourselves for too long.
And what's really interesting is that this feeling of unworthiness, it doesn't always stay internal. Tara talks about how we project it outwards, turning other people or even entire groups into the enemy.
Oh, yeah. Us versus them. It's everywhere.
Right. And the more we feel that inner sense of lack, the more we might fixate on the perceived flaws of others. It might be that parent who we feel didn't truly love us, the boss who's holding us back, the political group with different views.
It's like we're creating a villain in our own personal narrative.
Exactly. And focusing on that external enemy, it can give us a temporary sense of control. It can make us feel superior, righteous, like we're doing something to solve the problem.
But as you said, it's temporary, right?
Right. Because while real threats exist in the world, meeting fear and vulnerability with aggression and blame, that only creates more suffering. True freedom, it comes from learning how to respond to our own vulnerability, not attack someone else's.
This brings us to what the Buddha said, right? About suffering arising from this mistaken understanding of ourselves as separate, independent beings.
Right. This ingrained sense of selfness, as Tara calls it, it traps us in these cycles of craving and aversion, wanting things to be different, pushing away what we don't like.
We forget that we're all connected, that we're part of this larger whole.
And what we experience as this solid individual self, it's really more like a collection of thoughts, feelings, and habits that are constantly changing.
Yeah.
Our minds are just so good at weaving them together into a story, right? The story of me that feels continuous.
And then everything we experience, it gets filtered through that me lens.
Exactly. It becomes my experience. I am feeling this. This is my desire. This happened to me. Ajahn Buddhadasa, he talks about I-ing and my-ing, which is a great way to describe it.
So if we're already in that trance of unworthiness, feeling inherently flawed, then that becomes the core of who we think we are, right?
Exactly. And when we constantly take life so personally through this lens of me and mine, that universal sense of something's wrong can become this deeply personal belief, something's wrong with me.
It's like this low hum of inadequacy.
Right. Sometimes we can't even pinpoint what's wrong, but the feeling's there. This anxiety, this loneliness, like just being an I separates us from belonging.
And the saddest part, as Kara puts it, is that freedom and peace are always possible. But we can spend our whole lives trapped in these patterns.
Right. We get so used to this self-made prison, we don't even see the bars anymore. We might yearn to love fully, to be authentic, to appreciate beauty. But those inner voices, the judgment, the doubt, they keep us feeling so constricted.
And external achievements, they don't fix it right.
No, because the root of the problem is internal.
Okay, so then how do we break free?
Well, that brings us to Chapter 2, where Tara introduces radical acceptance, and she defines it as clearly recognizing what's happening inside us and then meeting it with an open, kind, and loving heart.
Sounds so simple.
Yeah.
And yet so hard, right?
Right, because it's about being honest with ourselves about what we're feeling, not
About-
sugarcoating it, not pushing it away, and then meeting it with kindness like we would a dear friend. Because any part of our experience that we're rejecting, any part of ourselves we're pushing away, that's what keeps that trance of unworthiness alive.
It feels so counterintuitive. When pain arises, our instinct is to fight it.
Absolutely. And that resistance, it's not just physical, it's mental too. We get caught in these thoughts, this is wrong, this shouldn't be happening, what does this mean about me? That internal struggle just intensifies the suffering.
Like quicksand. The more you struggle, the deeper you sink.
Exactly. Even a headache can become this mental drama about how we're not taking care of ourselves.
Yeah.
And emotional pain, oh, that gets amplified tenfold by our judgments, the stories we tell ourselves about why we feel this way and what it says about us.
So how do we stop struggling?
That's where the two wings of radical acceptance come in, mindfulness and compassion.
Okay, let's break those down. What's mindfulness?
It's about paying attention to the present moment without judgment, just letting life be as it is.
But isn't judging kind of what our minds do?
Of course. But the key is to notice those judgments without getting caught up in them. to see our experience with clarity without the added layer of criticism. Whether it's pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, even the wish for it to be different, it's about simply observing.
Okay, and compassion.
Compassion is about how we relate to that experience. It's meeting ourselves, even those messy parts, with tenderness, like we would a hurting child.
So instead of judging our desires and fears, we meet them with understanding.
Exactly. We honor our human experience without needing it to be different. Compassion, it makes our acceptance wholehearted. Mindfulness gives us the clear seeing. Compassion gives us the loving embrace.
I love that. And in Chapter 3, Tara shares this really powerful story that brought this all to life for her. She talks about this intense experience at a meditation retreat.
It was a turning point for her. Her teacher, in front of everyone, basically condemned her, accused her of, well, contributing to her baby's death because of her ambition and ego.
That is harsh. I can't even imagine.
It was devastating for her, and she's left grappling with this feeling of injustice, but also this intense self-doubt. Like, what was it about her that would provoke that kind of reaction?
It must have been a whirlwind of emotions.
It was. She ended up in this little sanctuary at the retreat. And in that moment of complete vulnerability, this new voice emerged. This wasn't the judging voice. It was a yearning to accept herself, just as she was, to finally stop the self-criticism.
And she found herself praying, right?
Yes. May I love and accept myself just as I am. And she felt the shift, like she was cradling herself like a wounded child. Everything, even the fear and the doubt, it belonged. It was all part of her.
She connects us to the idea of hitting bottom, which is often talked about in addiction recovery.
Right, like her mother's journey with AA. It's in those moments of complete breakdown when our old coping mechanisms fail that something new can emerge.
It's like the ground falls away, but we land on something more solid.
Exactly. Over time, Tara realized that this experience at the retreat, it wasn't just about her teacher's actions. It was a mirror reflecting how she had been betraying herself. Through all that striving, all that judgment.
So the real betrayal was the one she was inflicting on herself.
Yes. That fear of being flawed, it was driving everything. And it was radical acceptance, accepting all of her feelings, even the darkest fears, that set her free.
She had to turn towards the pain she'd been running from.
And that reminds me of what Carl Jung said about the spiritual path. It's not about battling against an impure self. It's about unfolding into wholeness. Embracing life, the messiness, the imperfection, instead of constantly trying to control it.
I love that. And Tara, she contrasts this with her experience at the ashram, where the focus was on cultivating these very specific, elevated states of consciousness. And then she discovered Buddhist mindfulness practices. What was different about that?
Well, mindfulness, it's about opening to experience, allowing it to flow through you without interference, not trying to manipulate it. So instead of trying to get rid of unpleasant feelings, it's about learning to relate to them with care. Befriending yourself, not fixing yourself.
Chapter 4 is where the rubber meets the road, right? Beginning to trust. It's about the practices we can actually use. And she starts with breath awareness.
The breath, it's such a simple but powerful anchor. Always available. Right here, right now.
It brings us back to the present moment.
Exactly. When our minds wander, which they do, we can gently bring our attention back to the breath. And if a strong sensation in the body grabs our attention, she guides us to shift our focus there, just feeling it with curiosity, noticing the qualities, how it changes.
David White says it so beautifully. If not this breath, this sitting here, this opening to life we've refused again and again until now.
It reminds us that this breath, this moment, is our opportunity to connect with life. Tara then brings in this analogy of Air Force pilots flying at these crazy high altitudes. And they would sometimes go into these uncontrollable flat spins.
Scary stuff.
Terrifying. And you know what saved their lives? Doing absolutely nothing.
What, letting go of the control?
Yeah. It goes against every instinct, right? But any attempt to control the spin just made it worse. Letting go was the only way to recover. And she connects this to our own lives, how we try to control situations that are actually way beyond our control.
Oh my gosh, that's me all over. Worrying about my kids' grades, overthinking every little comment, strategizing every interaction.
Right. The more we fear failure, the more we try to control everything. But sometimes, like those pilots, the most effective response is to pause, to let go of the need to fix it and just be present. To trust that we have the resilience to get through it.
Okay, that's a good reminder. Chapter 5 is about the shadow of rejection, the idea that we bury parts of ourselves because we're afraid of being rejected.
Right. It's this fear that leads us to create what Tara calls the shadow. It's where we store all those emotions, thoughts, parts of ourselves that we believe are unacceptable or unlovable.
Like our inner vault of shame.
Exactly. And the root of it, it's often that feeling of being fundamentally flawed, not good enough. So we try to hide those unacceptable parts of ourselves.
So doesn't that just make it worse?
It does. The more we run from those parts of ourselves, the more power we give them. It reinforces that belief of unworthiness.
So how do we work with this shadow?
Well, first, we have to become aware of it. Tara gives an example of Laura and Phil. Laura would have these really explosive reactions, often stemming from feeling unheard and invalidated by Phil.
Like her feelings were being dismissed.
Yeah. And Tara shares the story of a fight they had after Laura quit her job. Phil's reaction wasn't exactly enthusiastic, and that triggered all of Laura's buried feelings of being unwanted and unimportant.
So those unacknowledged emotions in her shadow, they just erupted.
Exactly. It's a great example of how these unhealed wounds can get triggered at our closest relationships, leading to conflict and reinforcing those feelings of unworthiness for both people involved.
And that brings us to Chapter 6, the sacred pause. This idea of finding power in stillness.
Yes. And she starts with this beautiful story of Siddhartha before he became the Buddha. He's watching the spring plowing, and he experiences this overwhelming sense of peace and compassion.
What was it about that experience that was so significant?
It was an awakening that happened through simply being present, not through striving or intellectual understanding, but through stillness and receptivity. And it showed him a different path to liberation, not through rigorous practices, but through learning to stop struggling and just meet life as it is with an open heart.
So not chasing the good or pushing away the bad, but just being present with what is.
Exactly. That's the middle way. And when we pause, even briefly, that's where we find that balanced presence. It's like a glimpse of the freedom that's always available to us when we let go of the struggle.
And then there's the story of Siddhartha facing Mara, right? Under the Bodhi tree.
Yes. Mara, who represents delusion, the forces that keep us trapped, he tempts Siddhartha with greed, hatred, fear. But Siddhartha meets each challenge with mindfulness and an open heart. He doesn't grasp or resist, and in that stillness, he transforms them.
That's a powerful image. And she gives a more down-to-earth example, too, right, with Laura and her mom.
Right. Laura, in the middle of a fight with her mom, remembers to pause. And that pause, it gives her the space to see beyond her mom's anger, to the insecurity that's driving it. So instead of reacting, she responds with understanding and kindness.
And that changed the whole dynamic of their interaction.
It did. And that pausing, it also helped her in her relationship with Phil. During an argument, she stopped, took a breath, and was able to express her deeper fears of feeling unwanted. It led to a much more honest and vulnerable conversation.
It's like that pause, it creates a crack in the armor.
Yes. And through that crack, real connection can happen.
So we need to practice pausing more.
Yes. Especially in those moments when we feel that urge to react. Because radical acceptance, it's a practice.
We actually experience those pauses naturally throughout the day, don't we? When we're in the shower, going for a walk, driving, those moments when our minds naturally quiet down a bit.
Ajahn Buddhadasa calls those moments temporary nirvana. It's like a little taste of the freedom that's possible when we let go of grasping and resisting.
I love that. Pockets of peace. In Chapter 7, The Power of Inquiry, we meet Jacob, who is attending a retreat while living with a serious illness. And Tara is struck by his incredible resilience and acceptance.
Jacob, he really seemed to embody that idea of meeting life as it is, with curiosity, with gratitude, even with humor. When Tara asked him about it, he just said, it feels like real life. And he shared the story about a time when he was giving a talk on Buddhism, and he was suddenly hit with this wave of confusion.
Speaker's block, but for a Buddhism talk.
Exactly, and he panicked. But then he just started naming what was happening inside him out loud. Afraid, embarrassed, confused.
What happened?
He said this calmness washed over him. His body relaxed, his mind cleared. Just by acknowledging his experience, without judgment. It was a powerful demonstration of how simply naming what's happening can shift our state.
So, inquiry, it's about asking ourselves those open-ended questions about what's happening right now.
Exactly. Not trying to analyze it, not trying to fix it, but just bringing it into awareness. Tara says it's important to do this with the spirit of friendliness towards ourselves.
Because if we go into it with judgment, we're just reinforcing that not good enough feeling.
Right. And she gives this example of Carl. He's struggling with bitterness and fear, and when she asks him, "Carl, what's happening right now?" He says, "I feel like an absolute failure." And just saying it out loud, it brings him relief.
It's like finally acknowledging the elephant in the room.
Exactly. And then she talks about the practice of noting or naming. It's about recognizing the flow of our thoughts, feelings, sensations, but with a gentle awareness.
So if you're feeling anxious, you just say, anxiety is here.
Exactly. Or tightness in my chest, or story about messing up is present. It creates space and it helps us to feel more at ease, even with the discomfort.
In Chapter 8, she tackles this idea of saying yes. But she makes it clear it doesn't mean approving of harmful things or denying difficult situations.
Right. It's about an inner yes, an acceptance of what is, a willingness to let our thoughts and feelings arise and pass without clinging or resisting.
So even if someone is being abusive, we say no to that behavior, but we say yes to the feelings that come up.
Exactly. The inner yes isn't about condoning negativity. It's about creating space for our experience, whatever it is, to just be, and then it can move through us.
There's this freedom, this sense of ease that comes when we realize that life is just fine as it is, when we stop comparing it to some idealized version in our heads.
Yes. And Tara, she really emphasizes the liberating power of saying yes to our whole messy, imperfect life. It's in that embrace that joy can actually come in. And letting go of perfectionism, that takes practice. We'll stumble, but learning to meet those moments with self-compassion, that's key.
She shares that story about her son, Narayan, who was resisting something she was asking him to do. And instead of reacting, she paused, recognized her own fears for him, and was able to respond with more understanding.
And then she quotes someone who asks, "Are we truly present in our own bodies? So often we're living in anticipation of the future instead of inhabiting the present."
So true. And that leads her to this realization about the power of the breath. It's like this pathway into a deeper connection with our physical selves.
The Buddha called it mindfulness centered on the body. And it makes sense because our sensations, they're the foundation of our experience. They trigger our emotions, our thoughts. So a big part of the practice is learning to recognize when a thought arises and gently bring our attention back to the sensations in the body.
Letting go of the stories and coming back to the felt experience.
Exactly. And she talks about pain, reminding us that pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional.
What's the difference? I mean, pain hurts.
The difference is our reaction. Mindfulness of pain, it allows us to see it as just pain, a sensation. We don't have to contract into a victim or get lost in our stories about it. It's that fear and resistance that turns pain into suffering.
So by resisting the pain, we're actually creating more suffering.
Exactly. We get so caught up in our mental stories about the pain that we miss the actual experience of it. And that's where mindfulness comes in.
She also talks about traumatic pain and how that can lead to dissociation from the body. Like with Rosalie's story, the abuse she suffered led to this rigidity in her body, anxiety attacks, and eating disorder.
Trauma can make us disconnect from our bodies as a way to cope. And that unprocessed pain, it keeps us on high alert, reacting to situations as if the trauma is still happening.
Like our nervous systems are stuck in the past.
Right, and she talks about how Rosalie needed to feel safe before she could even begin to process that pain. And the trust she built with Kara, that provided the safe space she needed. And as she learned to mindfully open to those sensations, even the scary ones, it helped her feel more at home in her body again.
In Tara, she shares her own experience with a stomach illness and how challenging it was to stay present with the pain. It's a good reminder that this is an ongoing practice, not a one-time fix.
Absolutely. And then she gives us guidance on how to soften our resistance to pain, to bring a gentle attention to the sensations, noticing the qualities, how they change, just being with it without judgment.
Okay, moving on to Chapter 9, What is Desire? She starts with this Dalai Lama quote, "Everyone wants to be happy. No one wants to suffer." And she connects this desire for happiness to our fundamental instinct to just, well, exist.
That desire to exist, to thrive, it's woven into the fabric of life itself. Think of it as a force of attraction, a pull towards connection, from tiny particles forming molecules to humans seeking love and belonging.
Like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, from the basic, like food and shelter, to the more complex, like meaning and purpose.
Exactly. And meeting those needs, it brings satisfaction. But the thing is, Tara points out, our wanting can get so complicated by that trance of unworthiness.
So instead of just wanting connection, we might need constant validation to feel worthy.